Hi everyone, welcome to the third and final mini lecture video for week one. So in the first two videos we've looked at a rough outline of Wittgenstein's life and some of the philosophical twists and turns that he was involved in. And then in video two I wanted to give you an indication of what the Tractatus is about. And the relationship between questions in the philosophy of logic and in the philosophy of meaning, or the philosophy of language. Well, now I want to ask and give some answer to the question, why was Wittgenstein so interested in logic or in questions in philosophical logic? And how did this occur? Because answering this question, giving a bit of a historical background here, will show us what sorts of answers to the questions he was asking in philosophical logic he didn't like. So there's this kind of background context where he was reacting against other people's inadequate, in his view, answer to the questions of what does logical truth consist in, what does a logically true statement mean, etc. So it's important to fill in this historical background to see what Wittgenstein was reacting against. Because another thing about reading the Tractatus is, when you read lots of philosophy nowadays, you see authors cite other authors and say, well, X and Y say this, and that's wrong because I don't think that such and such follows. Well, Wittgenstein does mention people a couple of times in the book, but by and large, he's not mentioning other people. So it's mostly leaves you sort of feeling a bit like he's philosophizing in a vacuum, but he isn't. The Tractatus is a response to other people. So let's have a little look at who it was a response to and why it was a response to them. So we'll start with the first question. Why was Wittgenstein so interested in logic? So the answer here is basically historical or biographical. Wittgenstein, I said in the very first video, in about 1908 to 1909, was studying aeronautical engineering at the University of Manchester. And as he was doing that, he was getting more interested in mathematics because he was studying engineering and he was getting drawn into more abstract issues in mathematics. Now, he then started to get interested in issues which are now referred to as issues in the foundations of mathematics. What does that mean? Well, I think it means something like the philosophy of mathematics. Right. We've talked about the difference between the philosophy of logic and logic, the difference between the philosophy of science and science. Well, I think the foundations of mathematics is a bit like the philosophy of mathematics, as against just doing mathematics, doing calculations. So the questions that Wittgenstein became interested in were questions like, what makes a mathematical sentence true? Yeah, there's 1 + 1 = 2 is true, no one would deny that. But it seems to be true in a different way than a sentence like, Ollie is the instructor of this module is true, right? Seems to be 1 + 1 = 2 seems to be a necessary truth. And so there's questions like, why are mathematical sentences which are true necessarily true, as opposed to contingently true like other sentences? So there's that kind of question. In what does the necessity of mathematical truth consist? That's a kind of question that Wittgenstein was getting led into. Further questions like, what do mathematical notions mean? What does number one mean? The expression one mean? Or what does the expression addition mean? Or subtraction or division, etc. What do those words mean? So interesting philosophical questions. And Wittgenstein was getting drawn into this because he was doing engineering and he was working with mathematics all the time, but obviously he was a kind of philosophical person and he was inevitably thinking at a more abstract level, going, well, why is this true? Why is this true? And why has it got this strange character of being necessarily true? So he's starting asking all these questions about the foundations of mathematics. Now, at the time, research into the foundation of mathematics was sort of beginning to become more popular. People were turning their attention to that. And in particular, interest in the foundations of mathematics was spearheaded by Gottlob Frege and Bertrand Russell. Wittgenstein first went to go and visit Gottlob Frege, and Frege told him to go and visit Russell. So Wittgenstein did. In 1911, he went to Cambridge and just arrived in Russell's room and just started sort of talking to him. I mean, this is an indication that Wittgenstein is used to... I mean, he's from high society. He's not used to having to go through any normal channels. He didn't apply to Cambridge. He just turned up. And Russell was a bit bemused by this character who's sort of questioning him on all these issues in the foundations of mathematics, about the philosophy of mathematics. Anyway, Russell soon realises, or comes to believe, that Wittgenstein is clever and should study with him. And they do start studying together. And Wittgenstein learns about all of Russell's answers to these questions in the foundations of mathematics. So Russell shares with Frege at this time a view about mathematics called logicism. What does logicism mean? Logicism is the view that the truths of mathematics really just are truths of logic. So if you're a logicist, you think that given any truth of pure mathematics, not applied mathematics, like just pure mathematics, given any truth in arithmetic, for instance, like 5 plus 5 equals 10, that sentence, 5 plus 5 equals 10, is really just a disguised logical truth. You can translate that sentence without remainder, with no loss of information, into purely logical notation. And then you'll have got some insight into what 5 plus 5 equals 10 really means. You've made some kind of explanatory progress. You've got all these mathematical statements, translate them all down into just purely logical statements. And Russell thought that this was true, so all of mathematics just basically was disguised logic. This sounds still a bit abstract. What does it mean to say that you can translate a mathematical statement into a logical statement? Well, a purely logical statement is a statement involving expressions which are exclusively logical expressions. So, in the sort of catalogue of logical expressions, we have words like identical, the word not, the word or, the word and, various sort of terms which are just purely logical, or the use of a variable, every x, or some x. They're kind of logical expressions. So Russell, insofar as he was a logicist, thought you could translate sentences of mathematics into sentences of pure logic, where the only terms appearing would be purely logical terms, like not, like every x, some x, etc., using only those terms. So that's what Russell thought. Why did he think that? What was it? Why was he doing that? Because it's quite hard, it's quite abstract. Why was he doing that? Well, Russell thought, this is a kind of popular interpretation, which I think there's a bit more to it than this, but for our purposes, we don't need to complicate it too much. So according to, for instance, interpreters like Quine or Carl Hempel and people like that, who were reading Russell in the 1930s and 40s, Russell thought that if logicism was true, then you had a good explanation, or a good answer to lots of those questions in the foundations of mathematics. Like, why are mathematical truths necessarily true? Well, if you can show that mathematical truths just are disguised logical truths, then the idea is that you've got an answer to why mathematical statements are necessarily true. It's because the logical statements into which they may be translated are themselves necessarily true, right? So the idea is that you can explain all of these peculiar characteristics of mathematics by identifying mathematics with logic, and then saying, well, you find all those characteristics in logic. That's where the maths gets its necessity from. It's because maths is logic, and logical truths are necessary. And so this was Russell's idea, logicism. Now, I think the most important thing to realise for Wittgenstein's purposes, and there's more detail on this in the lecture notes, more technical detail, which you should read, but maybe I won't go into it in too much detail here, because it's quite technical. You'll notice that Russell says mathematics has these properties of being, mathematical sentences have these properties being necessarily true, inconceivable to deny, because logical truths have those qualities. And mathematics is logic, really. Or you can translate mathematics into logic, or mathematics can be derived from logic, pure logic. Well, Wittgenstein, as we saw in the previous video, wanted to ask the further question. He wanted to ask a question like, why are logical sentences necessarily true? Right? So Russell thinks he's got an explanation of mathematics being necessarily true. And the reason why Wittgenstein is interested in logic, the reason why he writes the Tractatus, is because he thinks Russell has stopped too soon. Right? He's kind of stopped at logic. He hasn't explained the nature of logic or logical truth or what a logical notion is. So Wittgenstein says, well, if you're going to say that mathematics is logic, and you're going to get lots of interesting answers in the foundations of mathematics, then really you ought to be telling us a bit more about logic. Right? You think that 1 + 1 = 2 can be translated into some purely logical sentence. And again, I'm not giving the details here, but they're in broad outline in the lecture notes. And Wittgenstein saying, well, you haven't really told us much about the nature of logic. So we can see where Wittgenstein's interest in logic is coming from. It's because as an engineer he was interested in mathematics, then he became interested in the foundations of mathematics. He went to work with Russell, who was giving a certain kind of answer to these questions in the foundations of mathematics. And Wittgenstein was unimpressed with the answer Russell was giving, because he didn't think Russell was giving enough detail about logic. Now, Russell did have some kind of conception of what makes, what statements of pure logic mean. So Russell had some kind of answers to some of the questions in philosophical logic that we were asking in video 2. So remember we asked, what does a sentence of pure logic mean? Right? Everything is identical to itself. What does that sentence really mean? That's a question of philosophical logic. Well, Wittgenstein was unimpressed with Russell's answers generally about the status of logic. He thought he hadn't gone far enough. And with respect to this particular question, what do logical sentences mean? Wittgenstein was very unimpressed with Russell's answer. So Russell's answer to the question of what do sentences of pure logic mean was something like this. You've got a sentence like everything is identical to itself. You want to know, why is that a logical truth? Why do we call it a logical truth as opposed to some other kind of truth? Well, the reason Russell thinks that that's a logical truth is purely because of its generality. So Russell thinks that it's the mark of the logical that the sentence is supremely general. What does that mean? That means that it applies to everything. Okay? So Russell thinks that sentences of logic are logical insofar as they are utterly general. They don't really concern any particular subject matter. They concern all subject matter. Wittgenstein was unimpressed with this, and we will find out why in about 2 weeks' time or 3 weeks' time. But there's one important thing to say here about what Russell's conception of logical sort of meaning consists in. So Russell's view of the meaning of logical sentences, like everything is identical to itself, or anything which is true isn't false, sentences like that. He thinks that he thinks that logic, insofar as logic is a sort of body of truths which consists of those kind of sentences, he thinks that logic is basically a science of everything. So let me sort of elaborate on that. Let's start with a science which isn't about everything. Let's start with psychology, right? Psychology is a science of minds. So sentences of psychology don't concern everything. They concern minds, right? Now, maybe we take a step up and we go to biology. Now, biology concerns all living things. And within some of those living things are living things with minds. You've got oak trees, but then you've got, humans at one end of the scale. So biology is more general than psychology because it concerns more things. We can move up to physics. Now, physics concerns sort of matter and energy. So every living thing that biology concerns is composed of matter, right? And simultaneously, minded things that psychology concerns are composed of matter. So physics is more general than biology and psychology because it concerns matter, and both of these subsidiary sciences concern things with matter. So we have a kind of hierarchy of abstraction. We can go from psychology to biology to physics, where we're increasing the level of generality involved. Now, importantly, Russell's conception of logic was that logic, let's call logic the sort of body of logical truths, right? So logic in this context is everything is identical to itself, anything which is true isn't false, whatever else we want to put in there. Logic, according to Russell, was just another step of abstraction above physics. It was just another science, and physics concerns matter. An awful lot of things are composed of matter, or energy, but logic concerns everything. So we have a kind of, you can imagine it as an upside down pyramid: psychology, biology, physics, and then logic up here. So Russell thought that the mark of being logical, of being a logical truth, is just to be purely general. Now Wittgenstein was unimpressed with this because Wittgenstein, well, we will find out why Wittgenstein was unimpressed with this. But Wittgenstein was interested in logic because he was unimpressed with some of these answers that Russell was giving to these questions. Right, that's the main thing to realise. And we don't have to go through all the details of logicism and all these, it gets very technical. If you Google logicism, you'll get lots of technical stuff. We don't really need to go into that detail, but we just want to know why Wittgenstein was interested in logic and what kind of view of logic Wittgenstein was opposed to. Wittgenstein was opposed to the view that logical truth consists in just generality, and he was opposed to the view that logic is a kind of body of sentences constituting a science. Right? Wittgenstein didn't agree with that. We will find out what his alternative view was later down the line. But for now, I think that's enough to see Wittgenstein's motivation. Okay, so that's the third and final video for this week. Thanks for watching. do be prepared to get involved with those questions on the module handbook for this coming week. Okay, cheers. Thanks.